You walk away from the conversation, not angry, just drained. Your chest feels tight, your thoughts are racing, and you can't explain why such a simple talk took so much out of you. It wasn't a fight, there were no insults, so why do you feel like you ran an emotional marathon? That's the thing, some conversations don't look toxic on the surface, but they pull at you, subtly, quietly, repeatedly. It's the pressure to fix someone else's mood, the tension of walking on eggshells, the unspoken guilt traps, the emotional bait, the constant decoding of what the other person really means. That's not communication, that's emotional labor. And when it's one-sided, when you're always the one regulating, smoothing, absorbing, it doesn't just exhaust you, it erases you. These conversations wear you down not because you're too sensitive, but because your boundaries are constantly under silent attack. Some conversations drain you because they're not really conversations, they're performances. You're managing not just words, but emotions. Theirs, yours, the whole tone of the room. You might be talking to someone who dominates the space with their problems, leaving you no room to breathe. Or someone who speaks in vague hints, expecting you to fill in the blanks. Or worse, someone who plays the victim so convincingly that you feel guilty just for having boundaries. You don't get to be honest, you get to be careful. And being careful, constantly, is exhausting. You start anticipating their reactions before you even open your mouth. You edit yourself, you monitor their moods, you shrink. That's not a conversation, that's self-erasure disguised as connection. And the scariest part? You probably don't even notice it's happening until you're lying awake at night, replaying every word, wondering why you feel so empty. Part of the reason these conversations keep happening is because we're taught to endure them. From a young age, many of us are rewarded for being good listeners, for not making things awkward, for keeping the peace, even when it costs us peace of mind. So we learn to overfunction, to absorb, to soothe. We become emotional caretakers, even in conversations that are supposed to be equal. And every time we leave feeling depleted, we brush it off. Maybe I was too sensitive. They're going through a lot. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Empathy without boundaries becomes self-neglect. When you constantly prioritize others' emotional comfort over your own clarity and energy, you start losing your voice. Your nervous system goes into quiet survival mode. You stay in these patterns not because you don't see them, but because you've been conditioned to believe that leaving them makes you selfish. Sometimes the signs are subtle. You feel a tightness in your stomach before replying to a message. You mentally rehearse what to say, not because it's important, but because they're unpredictable. You feel responsible for their reactions, like their sadness or anger is somehow your fault. Other times, it's more physical. Headaches, fatigue, a sudden need to be alone after what seemed like a normal talk. Your body knows before your brain does. This isn't just a chat, it's a drain. You walk away not feeling heard, but used. Like you were there to carry something that didn't belong to you. And if this happens often, you begin to dread conversations altogether. Not because you don't care, but because you've become the default emotional container. That's not sustainable. That's how resentment builds quietly in people who seem nice on the surface until they finally burn out, explode, or disappear. Setting boundaries in emotionally draining conversations isn't easy, especially when guilt is wired into your nervous system. You worry you'll seem cold, uncaring, distant. So you stay in the call longer. You reply with more energy than you have. You say, "It's fine," when it's not. But here's the twist. The longer you delay your boundary, the heavier the cost. Not just emotionally, but psychologically. You start doubting your right to even have boundaries. That's how the cycle feeds itself. You overextend, feel depleted, then shame yourself for being too sensitive. But being overwhelmed by emotional labor isn't weakness. It's feedback. It's your inner system telling you, this is too much, too often. And here's the truth most people avoid. You don't need permission to step back. You don't need to justify your peace. Boundaries don't ruin connection. They reveal who's capable of respecting it. You don't need a script. You need clarity. Start with the smallest boundary, time. If a conversation usually spirals, set a limit. I've only got 10 minutes to chat. That's not rude. That's honest. If someone keeps dumping emotional weight on you, you can respond without absorbing. Try. That sounds really tough. Have you talked to someone about it? This redirects the emotional labor back to where it belongs, with them. You're not a therapist. You're not a sponge. You're a person with limits. And when a conversation starts to turn, when it feels like it's costing more than it's worth, don't explain yourself into exhaustion. Just say, "I need to take a break," or "Let's pause here." Your boundary doesn't need to be loud to be solid. You're not abandoning people by protecting your energy. You're just refusing to abandon yourself. When you start setting boundaries, the air gets clearer. You're no longer bracing for every text. You stop overanalyzing every word you said. You show up in conversations with presence, not performance. And the people around you begin to adjust. Some pull away. That's okay. Others lean in differently. With more respect, more awareness, more balance. You stop being everyone's emotional crutch and start becoming someone people actually listen to. Because you're not always managing. You're simply showing up, fully and honestly. That's the irony. When you stop over-functioning in conversations, your connections deepen. Not because you're doing more, but because you're finally being real. And slowly, the exhaustion lifts. You don't need to recover after every talk. You stop confusing constant availability with love. You start realizing that protecting your peace doesn't close the door on people. It opens the door to you. You deserve conversations that leave you feeling connected, not consumed, where you're not deciphering, fixing, or shrinking, just being. That kind of clarity doesn't come from reading minds or pleasing everyone. It comes from knowing your limits and honoring them, even when it's uncomfortable. You're allowed to disengage from what drains you. You're allowed to value peace over politeness. And no, you won't always get it perfect. You'll slip back into old habits, say yes when you meant no, stay too long in a dialogue that weighs too much. But every time you choose your energy, you're rewriting a pattern. Every time you say, this is too much, you're healing a part of you that believed enduring was the only way to be loved. Because now you know, love that costs your mental health is too expensive. So here's the question. If you stopped carrying other people's emotional weight, what would you finally have room to feel?